Last thing we had covered, the colonists are screaming, no taxation without representation. Well, Parliament came up with a different theory, the theory of virtual representation. They claimed that every member of Parliament represented all British subjects, even those in Boston or in Charleston, who had never even voted for a member of the London Parliament. Parliament consisted of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons represent everyone in England. So if you're in Lancashire, based on probably population and whatnot, you would get X number of representatives in the House of Commons. If you're from Worcestershire, now that's just made up. That's the sauce. England, then you get X number in the House of Commons. Well, we were saying we want actual representation. And England says you don't have actual representation, you have virtual representation. Every member in Parliament is interested in the best interest of the English Empire. So even though you 13 colonies don't have anyone sitting here in the House of Commons, the body as a whole has your best interest at heart. Worse yet, the legislation seemed to menace the basic rights of the colonists as Englishmen. Both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act provided for trying offenders in the hated Admiralty courts, where juries were not allowed. The burden of proof was on the defendant, who was assumed to be guilty unless he could prove himself innocent. Trial by jury and the doctrine of innocent until proven guilty were ancient privileges that Englishmen everywhere, including Americans, held most dear. The colonists, for all their time period, have been what they feel loyal British subjects. A Englishman had rights and privileges that no Frenchman had, that no German had, that no Spaniard had. And we valued those so much that after we separate from England and we create our Constitution, we will put those into our Constitution because we had enjoyed them as British subjects. Now, if you're caught violating the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act, you were not tried as a normal citizen in England would, where you have a jury of your peers and you go in innocent unless they can prove you are guilty. They said, we are trying you in the Admiralty courts, the military courts. And there the rules are completely different. We wouldn't have charged you if we didn't know you were guilty. So you go in guilty and must prove your innocence. Very different. You may not realize it, but innocent until proven guilty, their ability to come up with a case strong enough to convince a jury is ever so different than we know you're guilty and you have to come up with enough evidence to prove that you are not guilty. So, hey, we're Englishmen, and yet you've taken our rights away of trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty. And why was a British army needed at all in the colonies? Now that the French had been vanquished and Pontiac's rebellion crushed, could the real purpose be to whip the rebellious colonists themselves into line? Are you smelling it? There is a conspiracy afoot. England's purpose is not to collect taxes, all of this. They are, yes, they want that too, but they are going to whip us into line. Many colonials did not really want direct representation in Parliament. What do you mean? We're screaming no representation without, no taxation without representation. If they had obtained it, any member of the House of Commons could propose an oppressive tax bill for the colonies, and the American representatives could have been heavily outvoted. So fine. England says you can have members in the House of Commons. They wouldn't have any in the House of Lords, but you can have members in the House of Commons. We'll give you one for each of you, the 13 colonies, one from Georgia, one from North Carolina, South Carolina, etc. So, somebody from Lancashire says, we are paying way too much taxes here in Lancashire, and we found out that Pennsylvanians, New Yorkians, Massachusettsians are only paying a fraction of what we're paying. And so we are going to put through a bill to tax the 13 colonies at a 50% increase. Now, everyone votes on this in the House of Commons, large, unwieldy body. And every other borough and shire is saying, we'd like less taxes on our people too. The colonists, the 13 colonists, they get 13 votes against the hundreds of other votes. Can we now complain? No taxation without representation. No, you got taxed, but you had representation. Would we get outvoted every last time? Absolutely. The colonials really did not want taxation. No taxation without representation. They did not really want representation, though they said so. What they really wanted was a return to the good old days, when the navigation laws had been only laxly enforced, and the Americans had suffered virtually no taxation. Is that going to occur? No, but that's what they actually want, even though they scream, no taxation without representation. And we move on to the Quartering Act. Come on. Resentment was kept burning by the Quartering Act of 1765. So the Stamp Act was 1765, same year the Quartering Act. This required the colonists to feed and house British troops. All these troops being sent over, there is no Fort Bliss, Fort Bragg, Fort whatever. Yes, there is a little bit of military accommodations that have already been set up, but for the most part, there is no place to house these troops that are being sent. Now, U.S. colonial citizens are being forced to feed and house British troops. It applied to all colonies, but affected mainly New York City. Why? New York City was the headquarters of the British forces. The new act raised troubling questions in the colonies. Why was it necessary for British soldiers to be stationed in colonial cities in peacetime? We're not at war. What is the big idea? Was not the Quartering Act another example of taxation without representation, as the colonies had neither requested the troops nor been asked their opinion on the matter? Some colonists decided that the Quartering Act was an effort to use British soldiers to tyrannize the Americans. The New York Colonial Assembly defied the Quartering Act and refused to provide beds or supplies for British troops. Ooh, that's fighting words, fighting actions. Here in the place where the British Army is the largest, New York City, they are not going to provide any assistance. Americans felt so strongly about this that once again, in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, we have put this into it, that in time of peace, in time of war, in time of national disaster, in time of anything, our government does not have the right to force us U.S. citizens to house troops, to house firefighters, to house the National Guard, anything. Our government cannot force us to do that. That is how angering this made the colonists. The Sons of Liberty. They sprung up as a patriotic terrorist group in opposition to the Stamp Act. Yes, some reliable and good citizens were part of the Sons of Liberty, but yes, they really were a patriotic terrorist group. A lot of riffraff and whatnot, bullies and thugs, also ended up in the Sons of Liberty. They succeeded in directing violence against the Stamp Act in several American cities. In some cases, the riots got out of hand and resulted in injury to people and property sympathetic to Parliament. This is a picture from that time period. There's a lot of elements in this picture beyond just the Sons of Liberty. But here we would talk about the Liberty Tree. The Stamp Act here is posted, but it is being posted upside down. Over here you've got the Boston Tea Party taking place. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of things going on in this. But the Daughters of Liberty, mainly the Sons of Liberty, loved to persecute people who would not follow the patriot cause. And one of the punishments that they liked was tarring and feathering. People think maybe, oh, this is, what's the big deal? You make them look ridiculous and that's it. No, you don't realize what tar and feathering did. Now, this picture is also incorporating the tea tax and forcing tea down his throat. But if you are going to tar and feather someone, first of all, you have to make the tar malleable, make it easy to, shall I say, spread. And if you've ever seen people tar roofs, they heat this tar up in this contraption and smoke comes off of it and the smell is just horrendous. If you get a drop of boiling water pop out of the pan and burn you on the hand, that hurts for a second, but the water cools down very quickly. Let's say instead you're making spaghetti sauce or pancake syrup, something that is thicker, and a drop of that pops out of the pan and hits you on the hand. Because of its thickness, it will retain the heat and it will burn you much longer than a drop of water that immediately spreads out and cools down. So here you have this thick tar which has been heated to a level where it can be spread on a person. So it's pretty hot and it's pretty thick. You smear this tar all over a person and you are doing unbelievable damage. People die from this. The biggest organ of the body is the skin, and you can endure only so much percentage of your skin to be burnt or damaged before the possibility of surviving it is gone. People who have heavy burns, they get them to the hospital. They merely, with drugs, try and keep them in a comfortable state for the next 12, maybe 24 hours before they die. You cannot come back from too major of a burn. And with tar and feathering, you were covering the guy's body. Here they even show that they've put tar and feather on his head. And so this is excruciatingly painful. And then, of course, they would stick feathers on you. Ha ha, we all laugh. Getting that tar off is probably going to take the whole top layer, more layers probably even that, of skin off of you in trying to get that tar off. So tarring and feathering was no joke. It was a horrible punishment. Another example of the Sons of Liberty getting out of control at the wrong people. Here you have Chief Justice Thomas Hutchison and his home in Boston. He is a British official. He is doing what his king, what his country has asked him to do. And what do the colonists do? Do they respect that? I mean, we're all saying we're loyal British subjects. We want the rights and privileges of Englishmen. And yet what do? We burn his house. We trash his belongings. He did not deserve this. The most destructive riot was in August 26, 1765 in Boston, and that is the looting of Thomas Hutchison's home. The Stamp Act was never enforced, and in the fall of 1765, New England merchants began boycotts or non-importation agreements on English goods. American consumption of British goods fell so much that British shippers appealed to Parliament to repeal the act. Boycotting, non-importation, refusing to buy. Now that is all legit. Once again, before your time period, the immigrant workers, farm workers out west, particularly in California, it was felt were not being treated correctly. And so a local person, Cesar Chavez, and many of you may recognize the name, he fought for migrant workers' rights. And he took on a particular item, and that was table grapes, the grapes that people eat for meals and whatnot. Not the wine industry, but table grapes. And he said to Americans, I want you to join in boycotting table grapes until the owners of the vineyards agree to treat the migrant workers better. Now, this was no easy fix, and it took several years of him fighting for his cause, and every year consumption dropped as Americans got in line with him and said, yes, we will boycott. Do you have the right to boycott? Yes. No one says you have to buy an RCA TV. If you want a Zenith, well, then you go buy yourself a Zenith instead of an RCA. With non-importation, this is completely legitimate. You can refuse to take goods off the ship. You can refuse to sell goods in your store. You can refuse to buy British goods. And so they begin non-importation agreements. Here is a boycott handbill from Boston. William Jackson, an importer at the Brazen Head, north side of the town house and opposite the town pump in Cornville, Boston. It is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy any one thing of him, for in so doing they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. The sons and daughters of liberty did this. And what they are doing is they're saying, this guy, William Jackson, is not abiding by non-importation. He is buying British goods off the ships. He is selling British goods in his store. And so we desire that other loyal colonists to our cause would not buy anything from his store. So this is really negative advertising here. You don't want to get on the bad sides of the sons and daughters of liberty. William Pitt. William Pitt was in the House of Commons, a very influential individual, and he was for the American colonies. He applauded their boycott. He says, "Good for you. You stood up for what you thought was your rights." He was for less parliamentary influence over colonial matters. Even the king seemed willing to repeal the Stamp Act. The conclusion was that the Stamp Act was repealed. But, just in case you think you won one, colonists, no, you didn't. Immediately, the Declaratory Acts of 1766 was passed, which basically said that Parliament still had full authority over the colonies. Yes, we repealed this one thing, but that doesn't mean you won. That doesn't mean you are in charge. Parliament is still in charge, and we didn't have to repeal it, but we chose to repeal it. The Townshend duties. Charles Townshend persuaded Parliament in 1767 to pass the Townshend Acts. The most important of these new regulations was a light import duty on glass, white lead, paper, and tea. And of course, it's the tea that will bring in the biggest problems. Tea was coming in, and every colonial who was a Britisher was a drinker of tea. That is just part of life still to this day. And they were going to impose duties on British china, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imports to the colonies. Benjamin Franklin had informed the British Parliament that the colonies intended to start manufacturing their own goods rather than paying the duties on imports. Mercantilistic theory. Europe will provide the manufactured goods. The colonies will provide the raw materials. No. Now Benjamin Franklin is telling England, we are going to start manufacturing goods so that we don't have to pay the tax. These particular items were chosen for taxation because Townshend thought that they would be difficult things for the colonists to produce on their own. Well, we obviously can't grow tea here, but glass, all these other things, very difficult to make. He estimated the duties would raise approximately 40,000 pounds, with most of the revenue coming from the tea. I'm sorry, you just can't take tea away from an Englishman. Cartoon from that time period. Placard that is here, up on the wall. I enlarged it. The Townshend revenues. And you have a colonist standing here, reading this new tax on tea, while a British soldier is also walking past. And it says, "Nothing was thought but of this taxation and the easiest method of liquidation. 'Twas enough to vex the souls of men of Boston town to read this under the seal of the crown. They were loyal subjects of George the III, so they believed and so they averred. But this bristling, offensive placard, set on the wall was worse than a bayonet." So, yes, we did not appreciate this tax on tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties was an indirect tax paid at the ports, but the colonists were flushed with victory, and they were in a rebellious mood. Direct tax, indirect tax. Direct tax, the stamp tax. You paid for the item, then you paid for the stamp, and the stamp was stuck on it, and it was there in your face. You constantly saw it. It annoyed you half to death. Well, with the sorry, with the Townsend Acts, these prices would be tacked on to them at the port. So, come on, stay with me. So the merchant, say, buys 2 cases of tea. Now, most people aren't going to be able to pay for that much tea at one time when they go to the store. And so the merchant then parcels it out into smaller quantities that the colonist would then buy at a time. So let's say normally I buy this for 10 pounds and this one for 10 pounds. Now they're putting a 5 shilling tax on it. So now it's 10 pounds, 5 shillings. So when I package up this into smaller quantities, I simply incorporate those shillings into the 10 pounds on the price that I set for the smaller amounts. Do I see a stamp on there? Do I have to pay extra for the stamp? No, it's just incorporated into the price. So it is an indirect tax. The consumer doesn't see it. The Townsend duties, revenues, worse yet, would be used to pay the salaries of the royal governors and the judges in America. Non-importation agreements were quickly revived again. Do we feel we need royal governors and judges? No, we want to rule ourselves. And here we have the true Sons of Liberty and supporters of the non-importation agreement are determined to resent the least insult or menace offered to any one or more of the several committees appointed by the body at Faneuil Hall, that's their meeting house in Boston City, and chastise any one or more of them as they deserve, and will also support the printers of anything the committee shall desire them to print, as a warning to anyone who shall affront or, as aforesaid, upon sure information given, one of these advertisements shall be posted up at the door and dwelling house of the offender. So, Sons of Liberty say anything that needs to be printed will be printed, no charge practically, and if you don't abide by non-importation, we will take one of these warning signs and stick it on your door so everyone walking by your house will know. Sons and Daughters of Liberty caught him buying imported goods. Here, a protest where people have pledged, this is the pledge, I promise I will not buy British import goods that have the tax on them. And they signed their names. This is getting nasty also. They published a black list in the North American Almanac for 1770, identify those Boston merchants who had ignored the non-importation agreement. Among their number were certain individuals. So we are publishing for everyone to know. Look at these people who are not being loyal patriots. Well, they're being loyal Englishmen. Good heavens. Can't have it both ways. Non-importation agreements were quickly revived again. The colonists, though, overall took the new tax less seriously, as they could secure smuggled tea at a cheap price, and consequently smugglers increased their activities, especially in Massachusetts. Oh, we are loyal British subjects. Keep the money in the empire. You're not to trade with the Dutch. We're smuggling in Dutch tea. And that helps because it's cheaper than the British tea. Incidentally, Oh, shoot. Shoot. Oh, I just lost his name. One of our founding fathers. Oh, dang. He actually was heavily involved in the smuggling of all kinds of items into Massachusetts. Oh, shoot. Senior moment. I'll think of it in a minute. British officials now landed 2 regiments of troops in Boston in 1768. Liberty-loving colonials resented the presence of redcoats. They taunted them unmercifully, and a clash was inevitable. By 1769, more than 2,000 British troops had arrived in Boston to restore order. A large number considering that Boston only had 16,000 people in it. So that is a 1 to 8 odds. For every 8 people in Boston, there is 1 soldier. The troops disembarked and initially encamped on the Boston Commons, as well as in the courthouse and in Faneuil Hall. Friction immediately broke out when the governor offered the troops the manufactory house as a barracks. Skirmishes between Patriot colonists and British soldiers, as well as colonists loyal to the British Crown, became increasingly common. To protest taxes, patriots often vandalized stores selling British goods. Now, you can non-import, you can non-buy, but do you have the right to vandalize someone else's property that is trying to sell it? No, you don't. And they intimidated store merchants and their customers. Tension between the colonists and the British troops would boil over on March 5th, 1770. And a clash is inevitable. What will that clash be? The Boston Massacre. But we have run out of time. We will pick up with that later.